Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you. I had dinner with Ed and Martha and had a great time getting to know them, and I'm looking forward to being with you tonight. They've already warned me about everything I need to know. They told me Booker might talk back to me, and I said that's fine. You tell Marie she can join in too, and we'll just speak all you want. It's been called the problem of pain, evil, and suffering. It's a phrase you'll hear a lot. I hear it from my students all the time, even though they don't call it that. They'll just say, I don't know if I buy all this because let me tell you about real brokenness in my life. And it's a reason why I'm having trouble, not just believing what you're telling me, but believing what my parents told me or what anybody in the world's telling me. When I turn on the television, they're trying to run down my throat the idea that I ought to believe something different than what my experience is telling me. If you've ever had trouble in your life, and you don't know what to call it, it's just junk, and it's difficult, and it's frustrating, and it gets in the way of faith issues, and it creates faith struggles, then you'll know what I'm talking about. Problem of pain, evil, and suffering. David Hume, very, very famous philosopher from years ago, came up with a great little line to explain this. He said, if God is all-powerful, then surely he would have stopped the difficulties in our lives. If he's all-loving, surely he'd stop the difficulties in our lives. So if God is all-powerful and all-loving, that is, if he could stop it, and if he wanted to stop it, then why hasn't he stopped it? That's a really difficult question. If God is all-powerful, and if he is all-loving, then why is there pain, evil, and suffering in the world? It is listed as the number one argument against Christianity, against theism, is the problem of evil. What I try to tell my students is sort of a first argument to think about this, response to that, is to say that you need to realize that any time an atheist gets up in a debate and says, I am going to ruin my opponent because I'm going to announce that there's a problem and it's called evil, and he's going to try to give you an answer to it. Unless he gives you a good answer, you better not believe it. What I want to say back to them is, you are absolutely right that there is a problem, but it's a problem for everybody. It is not exclusively a problem for Christians. If you look at Eastern religions, some of them will say that there is no such thing as pain, evil, or suffering. It's a figment of your imagination. Has that been your experience? It's not. Doesn't seem like a good answer. Atheist ecumenism will tell you that really all we have is all we could have. We get the world as is. And it comes to us not prepackaged by some designer instead. There's no such thing as inherent moral categories. And what I want to say back is, if we have moral evil in the world, people doing bad things to people, if we have natural evil in the world with disasters and accidents and frustrations, if we have congenital heart defects people born with and struggle with, if we have cancer, and if we have tornadoes, and if we have hurricanes, and if we have Rwandan massacres, everybody's going to have to deal with that problem. It's not just Christians. And what I want to say back is, if you think the Holocaust was bad, and if you think the Rwandan massacre was bad, what makes it bad? What would you use to argue that it's bad? When a seagull grabs a fish in its talons, is that an evil act? When a lion kills a hyena, is that an evil act? So why would you just assume that if we get the world as is and there is nothing else out there, what makes it so bad or wrong to fight for your rights or to stand for yourself or to push people down when they get in your way? What makes those things bad? What answers are you going to give? Bertrand Russell in the 1930s said, science is telling us that what we have is simply a random collection of how atoms have reached the point they have, And if you want to know what we're going to hang on to, if you want to know what the future holds, these are his words, you must hold on to this, the firm, unyielding despair. That wasn't a negative statement from him. That was the best thing he had to offer. What do you have in a world where there is no God, no standard of right and wrong, no definition by which you determine moral rules, no sense in which people ought to behave a certain way outside of convention? Then what you have is the unyielding despair. Now, you might as well just make the best of it. It's a problem for everyone. And I'm not tonight going to solve the problem. But I want to tell you that I believe a story that at the center of it says that God one day will. It's a story about a cross. And it says that in the midst of God's great plan, involving lots of moving pieces, involving a desire for people to have free will, involving a desire for people to respond in love, and also being given options, and a world in which God doesn't just force things on us, but allows us to work and grow, sometimes in partnership with him, sometimes in opposition to him, and sometimes completely with him. We have a world in which difficulties and struggles and pain become a reality, and God jumps right in the middle of that. And he dies on a cross. And for reasons that I think a lot of people in the world will never understand, and for reasons a lot of Christians don't seem to understand, every single sermon in the New Testament, if you were going to give a title for it, is the cross of Jesus Christ. When Paul gets up in front of a bunch of philosophers, and he can talk about anything he wants to talk about, he says, I preach Christ crucified. There's something about the story of the cross that's supposed to be both true and resonating with the world. And I want you to know, if we're going to deal with the problem of evil, trying to skirt around it isn't going to be helpful to us or to the people out there who are struggling and needing answers. How about jumping right in the middle of it and say, let me tell you about a God who experiences brokenness, a God who allows himself to experience the full range of pain and evil and suffering in solidarity with us, offering a way forward through it. Now, there's a couple of different ways of dealing with how to get through it. The cross actually presents some difficulties of its own. Let's be real honest. I mean, where is God in the story of the cross? Have you ever heard anybody describe the cross in a way that makes you think that Jesus, he seems like a really good guy getting a really bad end of the deal, and it makes you kind of resent the Father a little bit? Here's Jesus in the garden saying, if there's any other way, take this away. And I've heard it from friends. What parent, if their child is begging to live, would let their child die? You can tell the story of the cross in a way that makes the Father look less than stellar. Where is God when I am facing the cross? When you're facing your own difficulties in life, is God right there beside you, helping you through it, or is he the one who put it on you in the first place? The cross raises difficult questions. Who's involved in the fight that creates the need for the cross in the first place? So tonight we're going to take a look at some of those. I want to go through some historical answers the church has given on how to think about the cross in a way that allows us to think good things about God. Jim McGuigan is one of my spiritual heroes, and he always says, think noble things of God. If you preach the cross, and you stand on the cross, and you present the cross as your first, number one argument for Christianity, make sure that what you're presenting is the picture of a good, loving God. The cross must present God in the light of his love, or you're not preaching the cross right. So let's think noble things of God. Here are 4 possible responses, and then a 5th one that's come up recently. 4 historical arguments. About 2 years ago, my friend Randy Harris was speaking out at Pepperdine and did a series on theology. What was it called? Theology for Dummies. It was 3 parts. Okay? I admit to being a dummy because I loved it and learned a lot. And in the 3rd of those series, he presented these 4 in such an interesting way. I'm going to borrow some of his ideas here to present these and then add one to them. Here's the first one. It's called the Ransom Theory. And the argument is that there is a price to be paid. Sin has created a serious problem in the world, and there's a price that needs to be paid. God is the one who's going to pay the ransom. Jesus is the ransom. And the ransom is being paid on your behalf and mine. Is there any Bible verses to support this approach? Yes, there is. Jesus, on his own lips, said, I have come to give my life as a ransom for many. In fact, in the history of theories of redemption, it's important to remember that ransom in Latin is redemptio. So the idea that a theory of redemption could possibly be about ransom is just in the word itself. It's an ancient one. Church fathers really liked this one. It's got some problems, though. If God's the one paying the ransom, Jesus is the ransom, and he's paying it for you, you know the next question, right? Who's he paying it to? Got any answers on that one? If you say he's paying it to Satan, can you see how this might create a problem? Jesus says in his earthly ministry, no man goes into somebody's house and takes his goods unless he first binds the strong man. And the point of the argument seems to be that Jesus himself is binding the strong man, because his answer, the whole question is, how are you able to do the things you're doing? And his answer is, if Satan casts out Satan, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't make any sense. A house is divided. But if I, by the finger of God, cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. The argument is Satan, as the strong man, is being bound by my actions. So if God really wants something from Satan, does he really need to ask permission or buy him off? So it's got some interesting truths, the ransom theory does, but it creates a difficulty. So some folks came along and said, well, I think that's one facet of how to look at the cross. Let's look at another one. So the second theory is called the satisfaction theory. Every time I think of that phrase, there's a song in my head. I can't get, you know the song. I can't get it out of my head whenever I start thinking about this one. This one is from St. Anselm. And Anselm lived at a time where it was very common to talk about honor and shame. And you think about what it's like, you know, the time period where somebody offends your honor, so you take out you take off your glove, which would hurt a lot more if you have armor on, and you slap the guy in the face, and you say, I demand satisfaction. The argument is that God's honor has been threatened. God's honor has been questioned. Sin ruins God's sense of honor, and God demands satisfaction. So the cross is not God paying a debt to someone. It is humanity paying a debt to God. And Jesus pays that debt on our behalf. You're probably thinking of some songs we sing that kind of fit with this theory. He paid a debt that I did not owe. All right. I owed a debt I could not pay. So for him, Jesus comes as the God-man. The God part is important because it means he has the ability to pay it. The man part's important because it means he shares humanity. Humanity has the obligation to pay it. So the God-man creates the perfect sort of answer to paying the debt to God. But it's also got some difficulties. It doesn't answer everything. Why does God seem to demand the death of his son to deal with a pride issue? Think about this. So we have a third argument. This guy's name is Abelard. He comes along and he says, actually, have you ever watched a scene from a movie depicting the cross? Or have you heard a song about the cross and you were moved to tears? Have you ever heard a sermon about the cross and your heart was leaping out of your chest as you thought, I've never heard a story of such amazing divine love? He says, if you have, then you get the point of the cross. One of my teachers answered a question in a British newspaper where the question was, if there's life on other planets, will God send other Jesuses? That was the question. If there's life on other planets, will God send other Jesuses? And I loved one of his possible answers. After saying, I don't know, he then, as all British teachers do, give 10 answers as to what he does think. And he says, well, nobody knows, but here's my arguments. And one of them was, the cross of Christ is such an amazing demonstration of a God who can't help but love. If there are creations of his anywhere in the world, this is the kind of thing God does. This is the kind of thing God does. God loves. Have you ever loved somebody so much that you said and meant it, I would die for you, and I would do it 1,000 times? The argument by Abelard is it's not so much about paying a ransom to God or God paying a ransom to Satan or anything else. It's the supreme example of love. And when it motivates you to see the world anew and to love unconditionally and to love so much that you can't stop loving, because when someone says, how can you still love when they've done all that to you? You say, let me tell you what they did to my Lord. And he kept loving. That's Abelard. Really, really sounds good. But it leaves out stuff. There's no mention of the weight or the debt of sin or the necessity of the death of Christ. Still raises that difficult question about, well, if it's an amazing show of love, isn't there other ways to do it than, say, watching your son die? There's no reference to Satan or evil as an entity. Fourth view, called Christus Victor, has made a big comeback, and it's really the Ransom Theory redone more powerfully. And the argument is that Christ is at this huge cosmic battle against Satan and evil. And the cross connected to the resurrection, never divorced, but connected to the resurrection, is the ultimate story of Satan trying everything he could do, and God allowing through Christ the submission of death so that ultimately he could defeat death by going through it. The greatest theological episode of the greatest theological show to ever go on TV was when Barney turned to Andy and he said, this is big. And Andy said, what are you talking about? He said, this is big. And he says, I don't know what you're talking about. All I know is that it's big. And Barney says, big ain't even the word for it. And what was it? Well, there was an escaped convict from Mount Pilate, and he was on his way down, going to be passing through Mayberry. And all the state police from Mount Pilate came into Mayberry, and they had their fancy magnetic buttons and everything else. And Andy and Barney had nothing. And so when Andy had an idea, they didn't really listen to him. They thought of him as a hick sheriff. And they covered all the major roads. And they said, you got any questions? And Andy says, I've got one tiny one. Suppose he doesn't come in on a bus. You've got all the major roads covered, but I think he'd choose a side road. And they just didn't listen to him. If you've seen the episode, you know that he thought it through, and he said, if I was an escaped convict, I'd go down by the river, and if I was by the river, I'd pass by Emma Brown's house, and Emma Brown always cooks pies, and I'd be hungry. That's where I'd be, and of course, that's where he is. And I just think that's such a great illustration of what's happening on Satan's side in the gospel stories. He's got all the major roads covered. I mean, when the curtain falls on the Old Testament, it's the end of the age of law, and you can see Satan like Mr. Grinch wringing his hands. He's got everybody. And when this curtain rises on the age of grace, what do you have? You've got the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Rome's in charge of everything. You've got Herod working the strings over the land of God, and he's got everything. He's got everything. And don't you think it sent shockwaves through Satan's mind when these wise men show up and say, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east. We've come to worship him." Immediately steps into action, kills all the babies 2 years and younger, but Jesus survives. At the baptism, the announcement from heaven is, "You are my son." Satan springs into action, tries to tempt Jesus, and it doesn't work. And then everything seems to fall into place. You get a disciple greedy for money. You get a Jesus who doesn't resist, and he dies. And Satan thinks, that was easy. Then he thinks, well, that was too easy. And it occurs to him, the story isn't over yet. The story is told, turns out not to be true. I've looked it up, it's not true, but it still sounds so good, I'm going to preach it as if it is true. The story is told that there was a painting in the Louvre, and everybody was walking by, and there was this painting of a chess match between God and Satan. And God looks worried, and Satan looks happy, and the title of the painting is Checkmate. And the curator explains, this was painted at the height of the Enlightenment to explain we don't need God to fill in the gaps anymore. And they leave, and one man stands behind, just staring at the picture, staring at the board. And being a chess player himself, he noticed something others didn't, and his eyes widened, and he said, "It's a lie. God still has a move." And don't you know that God still had a move? Christ rises from the dead. It defeats forever Satan's argument that humans have no right to enter into the throne room because the curse of sin and death is around their necks. But you break the curse of sin and death, the argument goes away. And that's why in Revelation 12, this great chapter about the devil and Satan fighting against Michael the archangel, it's the last time Satan is ever called the accuser of our brethren, because there's no more accusation. No more accusation but the resurrection. So Christus Victor, this great response back with the ransom theory tied together. Another theory, modern theory, there's about 12 of them, but they'll just list one more, says that in the cross, God identifies with every victim. You find somebody who's hurting or struggling or in pain. You tell them other religions, and other religions sometimes will give good self-help arguments or explain things that make you feel better about yourself, or say that one day, one time, somewhere, God will eventually make it right. But you tell them the Christian story, and the answer is, my God knows exactly what you're going through because he has been there. And in the cross we see that God is there. He identifies with the victim, not just sympathetically, but in reality. The early Christians had to deal with lots of frustrating things said about them. If you go into the early catacombs where the Christians met, you'll see paintings on the wall, frescoes, paintings. Sometimes the early church loved paintings on the inside of the walls there, and sometimes other people didn't like Christians would paint on the walls. One of the earliest arguments against Christianity was a drawing of a person on a cross, but his head wasn't a human head, it was the head of a horse. And the idea is, you worship a God who died? How ridiculous is that? And the early Christians said, you bet. Because unlike any other religion out there, I've got a God that if you're dealing with somebody who has been raped or abused or tortured or maligned or put down or hurt or struggled, my God identifies with victims. And the cross announces a king like no other. All those are good. And all of them speak to truths about the cross. And there's more, and I can't deal with everything, but I was thinking about this the other night when I was putting this together, that I want to leave you with some things that the cross says about God and suffering. I'm going to hit them fairly quickly, but there's 9 of them. Number 1, I want to press tonight for you to know that all these theories, all of which are good and speak right things, leave some questions for us, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page with these. Number one, the cross of Christ announces a united front on the part of God. I think you can preach the cross in a way that creates real difficulty, where you end up having your hero or champion. Christ was with me against the will of God. Christ was with me against a spirit who's forcing him to do what he doesn't want to do. That's not the right way to read it. Yes, we have those difficult passages of Christ in the garden, or Christ on the cross saying, "Why have you forsaken me?" Or Christ saying, "If there's any other way, let this cup pass from me." But you must remember that the Christ who dies on the cross is God himself. And so what God is announcing to us is that he understands every side of this painful ordeal. God the Father had a will. Isaiah 53, it pleased the Lord to crush him. God had a will that included the cross. But in John 10, Jesus announces, it's my will too. Jesus says, I lay down my life. No one can lay it down or take it from me. I lay it down. And in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 14, a very interesting passage, a very Trinitarian passage, it says, Jesus and the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself up to God. We have a united front. Do not read the cross story as a way of appeasing an angry father by a son, or a way of getting around a technicality from a God whose hands are tied. Read it as a united front, with all the difficulties and dangers and pitfalls involved when you're actually in the situation and you sense the pressure. But from beginning to end, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are united, and this is what needs to be done. There's a united front. Number two. Oh, I still want to say something about number one. Do you have the picture of the fresco? Yes, this is good. This fresco hangs in a Benedictine church in Italy. And what I love about this painting, it was painted by a man who died at the age of 26. He was, I think, 23 or 24 when he painted this. And what I love about this painting is, I don't know if you can see it, there is the Spirit in the form of a dove. It's very hard to see, but it's right by Jesus' head. It's descending down. It looks like you can see a little bit of a beak there, right on the side of Jesus' head. The Spirit's descending. The Father, the Son, the Spirit are there. Jesus' eyes are closed, probably already dead, but the Father's eyes are very much open and mourning. And where are the Father's hands? They're holding up the cross. Here is a beautiful picture, not of a father standing back, abandoning him at that moment. And not of a father finally saying, good, I've got the gift that somebody owed me. It's a father looking at you and me and saying, I don't know what to say except this. The cross presents a united front, but don't for a second think that it means that all three of them enjoy the moment. But there's joy that comes from the moment. Christ, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. And so did the Father, and so did the Spirit. It's that great passage in Acts, which is probably a reference to the divinity of Christ, but I think it's also a reference to the power of the Trinity unity, that says, elders, make sure that you feed the church of God, which he purchased. Do you know how that ends? With his own blood. God has blood? You bet it. Because when Christ dies and sheds his blood, every member of the Godhead experiences, in some sense, what you're going through. God is deeply involved in the cross. That's number one. Number two, in the cross, human freedom is respected and maintained. I don't know about you, but I've thought about what would I do if I was captain of the universe? What would I do? Well, If I'm driving down the road, no other cars would be driving. You would be stalled, and I'd be able to go as fast as I want to go, wherever I want to go. And if somebody cut me off in traffic, you'll wish you hadn't done that. And when I need something, it's going to be available. There's no waiting on anybody else. If I was in control, I would make sure that your freedom was hindered for my benefit. Good thing I'm not in control. God's in control. And God so loves the true meaning of a relationship that he respects our human freedom even when it costs him everything. Why didn't God just find some way around it? Why didn't God just say, all right, end of the game, we're stopping here? The same reason that when you're given the option to either have a child or have a robot, if you're given the option between, say, making your child give you a birthday card on your birthday because if he doesn't, he's grounded, or he does it because he wants to, or the difference between your spouse being faithful to you because they love you, not because of all your ultimatums about what you'll do if they aren't, you'll understand what real relationship means. It means the possibility that they won't come through like they should, which allows the real joy when they do. God maintains human freedom. And the fact that God voluntarily chose the cross is an announcement that says, I respect your voluntary choices. You have chosen sin. You have chosen rebellion, and I am choosing to save you. God's hands. Not only are our hands not tied, number 3, in the cross, God's hands aren't tied. God's freedom is expressed. We shouldn't think that God's hands are ever tied. God freely chose to create us. He freely chose to love us. He freely chose to redeem us. He wanted it that way. All the free will and all the options that ensue, he wanted it that way. And in the cross, God willingly chooses to enter into our story. My God, who is above all and through all and in all, who isn't just the biggest thing at the end of a cosmic chain, but instead is so other, you can't even put it into words, enters into the story and suffers and chooses to do it. Chooses to do it. Number 4, in the cross, God acknowledges the reality of suffering. The cross acknowledges that there is such a thing as pain and evil. It doesn't hide from it. It doesn't shy away from it. There are religions and there are peddlers of religion who will sell you all sorts of things to make you think that pain and evil and suffering are either unreal or simple. There is the silly and cheesy kind of health and wealth gospel that really is junk and ought to be treated as junk. If you are facing difficulties in your life and any man of the cloth comes to you and says, if you just have enough faith, your difficulties will go away, send them away. Because not only is that so untrue, it is deeply painful and it doesn't make sense. You think Paul, the Apostle Paul, who was hanging on to a piece of wood after being shipwrecked for who knows what number time, or after being stoned at Lystra, do you think he thought to himself, if only I had stronger faith? Do you think Peter, which tradition tells us was in a prison cell that's 3 stories down underground? The stench is so horrible, the soldiers don't even want to go down there. Being chained to the wall in a way that you couldn't lay down or sit down. Who is singing songs to God and according to tradition, converts 60 prisoners before they take him out to be crucified upside down. Do you think if he only had stronger faith? and it doesn't make sense of the cross at all. Do you guys know Patrick Mead? Patrick Mead said, "The center of our religion is not a big bunny holding flowers. It's a cross, and we call that a clue. Christianity is not the answer to how to avoid troubles. It is what to do with troubles, how to make sense of our troubles, and how to willingly accept them." Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's going to be down here. "For the sake of others." The cross provides answers, ways of dealing with real life, not skirting around it. 5 minutes? Good. Only got about 45 left. All right. Number 5, in the cross, God gives meaning and purpose to suffering. C.S. Lewis once said, "Some people say that if God's good, it won't be difficult." He says, "Have you ever been to the dentist? Just because it's painful doesn't mean the person involved isn't good." God brought salvation through the flood, and he molded a nation from a vagabond in the wilderness. God can bring beauty from ashes. There was a 12-year civil war in El Salvador, which was awful. But within a 20-year period, the number of evangelicals rose from 2.3% to 20.5%. Chairman Mao did his evil deeds, and China is still suffering because of it. But in the last, 30 or 40 years, there have been 50 to 75 million people converted to Christ. God can bring beauty out of very difficult situations. My favorite story is a story that happened in the West Nickel mines in 2006, when a man shot and killed 13-year-olds, Amish school children. And CNN and ABC and NBC were going to come and bring their cameras for a week of heartache and talk about the difficulties of life. But instead, the story changed. The very day in which the children were killed, one older man was heard saying, "You must not think evil of this man." And the older man was a grandfather of one of the children. 2 days after all the money came pouring in to help the Amish community decided to split the money in half and marched arm in arm to the home of the widow of the shooter and said, "We think you must be suffering as much as we are here. We should help you with your pain." There were people in the Amish community who spoke at the funeral of the shooter in his defense, asking for God's mercy. And CNN and ABC and NBC changed their headline from massacre to amazing grace. Sometimes the greatest truths are preached against the backdrop of the greatest loss, and the cross announces that. It's so real and so powerful and so beautiful. Number 6, in the cross, God shares in our suffering, which reveals his unfathomable goodness, love, and mercy. Number 7, in the cross, God sets the example for the way of suffering. He says that if I, your Lord and Master, choose the way of suffering when given the opportunity, you do the same. The cross isn't just a relief that says, when I happen to have difficulties, perhaps there's an antidote. It is our way of life, which fits with number 8. In the cross, God identifies with every struggling soul, and so must we. We tend to maximize our personal troubles and tend to minimize our corporate troubles. And that means we spend an awful lot of time analyzing ourselves and having pity parties when we reflect on not getting what we want, which is a luxury. But in cases like that, we need to recognize that the two most important questions when we look at the cross is, what did I do to cause this? And number 2, why am I not there with him? And when you see difficulties in this world, before we place the blame at the feet of God, why don't we ask, what am I doing to help or hurt this situation? And why am I not in solidarity with those who are struggling? This is the way of the Christian. Consider our prayers. Be with the sick. Give the preacher a ready recollection of the things he's prepared. Forgive us of our sins, with no clear enumeration of what those sins are. But how often are our prayers and our hearts focused on those who are truly, truly suffering? The cross is a challenge to our self-centeredness. That God, who has every right to think only of himself, at that moment thought nothing of himself, but made himself of no reputation, and took the form of a servant and identified with us. My last point is that I have looked at other answers to the problem of evil, and in my opinion, the cross is the only solution to the problem of evil. It is a real problem for everyone. But anytime you're talking to somebody about the problem of evil, share the story of the cross and ask what other story compares. What other way of life makes sense? What other approach takes the reality of suffering and infuses it with an ultimately loving God and the free will of humankind and identification with us in our struggles and hope for the future? It is the greatest story in the history of the world because it is in fact true, and it was truly done by our majestic Lord. Thank you for letting me go over time. Ed, would you come and lead a prayer?